If I can, is this working? Hello, hello? Hello? Testing, testing, let's see. Oh, hello, hello, hello? If I can call Charlene and Amy to the stage. Hello? Ah, look at that. Hello, hello. Does that work now? No. Testing, 1, 2. I'm so close. If this. Charlene, Amy. Hello? Is this on? Hello? If I can have everybody's attention, but we need this. Try your mic. Are you guys mic'd up? You're mic'd up, Amy? Say something. I'm just going to use this. Okay, everybody, if I can have your attention, we have an absolutely stellar panel. I should start off by saying we did not coordinate with President Biden to impose the tariffs right before we had this meeting. The Ambassador Barshefsky and Amy Celico need no introduction, and if you need an introduction, you've got their bios on our handout today. But two of the most knowledgeable people on trade and national security that we have in the United States. You know, as you know, Charlene was our deputy USTR for 4 years, and then the United States Trade Representative for 4 years. So 8 years of government service at a time when we made extraordinary progress on U.S. China trade and economic relations. So hearing her views will be incredibly important. And Amy Celico has what, 25 years of experience? You're too young to have had 25 years of experience.
I was a kindergartner at the Hopkins Non-Jing
Working
Center.
on China, but really two of the great experts. I'm not going to take up any time with longer introductions, but let me turn over to Amy, who's going to ask Charlene a bunch of questions, and then we'll allow the audience to ask some questions. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Steve. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be up here with Ambassador Barshefsky. Just in case you haven't seen my bio, I worked at USTR, and now I'm interviewing USTR. And so, Charlene, I can't help myself, given our common pedigree. The first question has to be what Steve alluded to. What did you think about what was announced last week by President Biden? I'm going to ask what the Chinese thought, what you think the forward-looking strategy is, but really curious to get your perspective on the tariff announcement, extending 301 tariffs, and then, of course, raising tariffs on a whole host of, you know, strategic industrial products.
I think extending, first of all, let me just say, it's great to be with you, Amy, and wonderful to be here. I think extending the tariffs that existed was born of political necessity, but does not represent, I don't believe, a policy or an approach, rather, that President Biden would have taken had those tariffs not been in place. In other words, the tariffs that were in place were not strategic. They hit the lowest 2 quintiles of the income distribution, most especially hard because of the indiscriminate nature of the tariffs and the fact that tariffs were put on many products, which are lower end products that are more concentrated in the lower quintiles of the income distribution. So tariffs, of course, are regressive, but in the case of these blanket tariffs, were particularly regressive, hitting the people you least want to hit, bearing in mind tariffs are taxes, and they are not paid by the exporter, they're paid by the importer. With respect to the tariffs that the president announced, I think it speaks to a more carefully constructed policy. You can debate whether you like the policy or not, but it is more carefully constructed. It is national security based. It is more targeted and set at levels deemed to be important to national security, but not excessively so, although the absolute number sounds high. And I think speaks to an approach that's more careful. Again, you can disagree with the approach, but it's a more careful approach, or an attempt to be more careful and more carefully align the use of tariffs to more legitimate policy objectives, which in this case is national security directed.
So as two professionals who did spend a lot of time trying to lower tariffs around the world, I have to admit, I'm still wrapping my head around the economic prosperity part of that balancing act that we're going to be talking about for this hour. I get the national security considerations, but I do wonder, what is this going to mean for our economic prosperity? If this is the kind of policies that, for national security purposes, to compete with a country that uses a different set of rules. Certainly, we can't out-industrial policy China, but maybe we're trying a little bit with the Chips and Science Act. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why this is necessary, because things maybe have changed substantially, certainly since you and I were working at different times at USTR.
Well, let's just stipulate, I'm not particularly fond of tariffs. I'm not a trade barrier kind of person, generally speaking. I'm a fair trade person. I like to see a level playing field. I'm extremely aggressive when it comes to enforcement of trade laws. And I think all of that is important, in part, not just for level playing field reasons, but rule of law reasons, and sort of an orderly construction of the market in a way that tries to balance the interests of producers, consumers, and so on. I think it's fair to say that in the case particularly of EVs, which I think is really the heart of the issue more than anything else, tariffs will increase prices. Interestingly, and Dan Rosen may have a view about this, but it's not clear to me even 100% tariff would make the U.S. auto industry competitive at such point as it develops sort of scale on EVs at the cost base that currently exists. But putting that aside, controversial because they may slow climate change adaptation. Controversial because lower price cars are in the interests of consumers, certainly. And cars that are more sustainably built are in the interests of consumers. Countervailing factor is China's carbon load in its manufacturing processes is very high, far higher than in the United States. And so the benefit you get from, for example, imports of Chinese EVs are offset in large part by the carbon intensity of Chinese manufacturing. So I think there are a number of factors the White House probably weighed on this. It is hard to get your head around these kinds of barriers as a general matter. In this case, I think the motives are pretty clear. Protection of the U.S. auto sector, particularly in an area to which the administration's industrial-related policies are geared. EVs is one of those sectors. You don't want progress made on the Inflation Reduction Act to be offset by a flood of imports. Another consideration is this issue of a second great shock, a second great China shock. So you'll recall that the famous economic study that suggested 1 to 2 million jobs were lost in the period roughly 2000 to 2003 to roughly 2011, 2012, largely because of a flood of Chinese imports. There were mechanisms in the WTO agreement to deal with that, which were never invoked, or never used, I should say, by the George W. Bush administration, and used only once by the Obama administration. And we live with the public response to that in the aftermath of not having used the tools available that could have substantially slowed imports at that time under certain circumstances. I think the Biden administration looked at that shock and thought, we can't have a second China shock, certainly not now, for various reasons, obviously, including our own economic difficulties. And that was another motivating factor, I think, for the tariffs. So you can parse it and decide that this was a rational response to an unusual situation for the U.S., which may have disadvantages, but also has advantages. And the balance came out with the advantages of doing it. Under different circumstances or in a different administration, the balance may have swung the other way. It's a very hard policy choice that has to be made, and the balance came out the way it came out.
I'll just ask one more question about this, because as I'm thinking about the tariffs being extended and then the grouping of new products that we're really seeing tariff hikes, some of it clearly is being driven back to the national security considerations of just trying to reduce our dependency on China and dependencies that were laid bare during COVID, because we saw medical devices on this list.
Sure.
You know, it's not all semiconductor chips
Sure.
and solar panels. And so I think, you know, when you think about that, the tariff raising is one thing, but then will it be backed by another Chips and Science Act for printed circuit boards or some kind of medical technology? I wonder when we, you know, end this discussion of tariffs, I'm sure we'll come back to it, and thinking about balancing economic prosperity with national security, we are paying a cost for this set of policies, no?
I think there's no question we're paying a cost. The issue, though, isn't the cost per se, it's the end to be achieved.
Mhm.
Look, as with most governments, once you use the phrase national security, people will buy off on almost anything. National security is fundamental. In this case, I think it's, for the most part, a legitimate use of the notion, narrowly phrased, of national security. We're not talking about security, cultural security, or other forms of security. Mm-hmm. I think China has 17 forms of national security. The U.S. has a couple. So will it spawn, will industrial policy beget more industrial policy? It's expensive. It may not be effective. And over time, these kinds of policies are in favor, and then they fall sharply out of favor. To some extent, the period of the 1990s, during, when globalization was sort of all the rage, you saw a sharp turn away from industrial policies and adoption of market-based norms. That worked well in the 90s, some would say, but look at the aftermath in the 2020s. So these things are complicated. There are no simple answers. You could have a philosophical bias in one direction or another, but most governments aren't philosophically oriented, right? They're interest-oriented, and they're the here and now oriented. And that's what you see we're responding to.
So I'm going to start us on a stroll down memory lane to get to the 90s, but I'd like to stop. I just checked last night, 10 years ago. So I remember when you penned an op-ed with Long Yong-tu. It was so interesting because I was a young, economic officer at our consulate in Shanghai when you were our U.S. trade representative, and working with him, and of course being famous for being such a great steward of our interests in your negotiations. You two must have had a lot of hours together, not pleasantly, but clearly coming together in 2014. You wrote this op-ed that was focused on advocating for the then Obama administration and their Chinese counterparts to get real about the bilateral investment treaty negotiations. This was 2014. This was the strategic and economic dialogue, the beginning of the second term, of course, of the Obama administration. I had been at USTR when we started BIT negotiations during the Bush administration. So I think a couple parties could be accused of foot dragging. You and Long both made the case for why integrating our economies more closely together by expanding, cross-border investment flows was going to be good for the relationship. So my question is, now looking back on it, when our two governments failed in that endeavor, what were the costs of that? Or was it already in 2014 looking too difficult to achieve?
It was already looking too difficult to achieve. 2014 is the year before Made in China 2025 was announced, right? Made in China 2025 was put forward in 2015. 2006, you had China adopting an indigenous innovation program, which was an import substitution program. 07-08, designation of strategic emerging industries, a raft of other designations along the way. This was becoming a different China economically, in terms of economic model. And by that, I mean this. The idea behind WTO accession is not to create sameness among countries. Countries are not the same. It's not to create the same economic system in every country. Countries have variations, some variations on the theme of market-based economics. There are many European countries that have variations. Some have sharp variations on other economic models. The idea to accession is to engender greater compatibility between models so that in the international trade space, you're talking the same language, roughly. You're roughly abiding by the same rules. Nobody's perfect. Certainly the US isn't. But you're roughly abiding by the same rules. You roughly understand the same concepts. You roughly have the same definitions for the same words. It's an idea that drives greater compatibility. And greater compatibility means less friction, more exchange. China adopted that drive toward greater compatibility until roughly 2006. And when indigenous innovation came out and its explanation for the program, and then the subsequent programs that followed, you saw an economy that had been on a more convergent course toward Western-based economics diverge, beginning to diverge in 06, 07, 08, diverge more sharply 2015, 16, 17, and then really diverge. Adopting a more state-led economic model, adopting a more top-down economic model, adopting a model that necessitated, under the model, greater government involvement, greater government interference, and a model that began to engender increasing levels of discriminatory behavior against foreign companies. And we see that today. I mean, this is every businessman complains about this. So once you see you're on a divergent course, and this becomes more and more apparent, and you're in the middle of a negotiation on a bilateral investment treaty, but now we're not really speaking the same language. The words don't have the same definitions, even roughly. Concepts aren't the same, even roughly. You realize this is not actually going to fit the way you hoped it would fit in order to come to an agreement. And remember, it's a treaty, right? So it needs congressional approval. So this became a very, very difficult exercise. And both sides actually began slow walking this, not just the US side, but the China side was concerned about some of the provisions in a bilateral investment treaty in a bit that would require more equal treatment than they were interested in giving. So it just fell away.
So my next question was going to be, what were the goals when going back before we come back to today? Final question about going back. It's going to be, what were the goals that you thought you did achieve when you negotiated the accession agreement? But I heard you that this greater convergence was the goal of, anybody coming to that. But could you talk a little bit about what were the goals that you tried to achieve in the 90s and up to 2001? And then how would it be different if you were starting that negotiation today with the Chinese? I mean, what you talked about with how China has changed behavior, of course, the Chinese government would accuse the U.S. government of undermining Chinese interests at every turn and really trying to prevent China from continuing to be able to grow, unfairly treating Chinese investors in the United States, restricting that access. So what that says to me is both sides just have such a deep level of mistrust. Would that just make the negotiation, forget about the need to have Congress ratify a treaty as a deal breaker, talking about US and Chinese negotiations?
Yeah. No, it would make it, you couldn't possibly do this agreement now. I don't think there's any way either party, I don't think there's any way anyone who became president would do that negotiation now. Even though some of the same factors pertain. So if you look at the 90s, what would impel the Clinton administration to embark on this? And administrations before the Clinton administration embark on the exercise of China joining the GATT, which was the forerunner to the WTO, its predecessor organization. Some of those reasons pertain today. China is, well, the world's largest population. Okay, now it's India by, a hair, but we really are splitting hairs. World's largest standing army, permanent member of the UN Security Council, substantial weight in Asia and substantial heft in Asia from the point of view of policy, but also culturally. an ally during the war, the big war. These things remain today. The difference is that when Deng Xiaoping took over, he began to liberalize the economy slowly, starting with agriculture, which increased, decollectivized the farms, for example, increased rural income, fivefold in 20 years. These liberalizations, starting in this smaller way and then growing, and these experiments and pilot projects that you all know about, spoke to a China that, as you looked at it in the early 90s, was reforming economically. These were autonomous reforms. They weren't the product of other negotiations by and large. They were China looking at the West, seeing extreme prosperity, seeing on their side extreme poverty, and saying, we want what they have. Makes total sense. And so they began slowly to adopt some of the characteristics of a more classic market-based model with Chinese characteristics always. What do you have today? Well, this is not what you have today. You have effectively the end to reform and liberalization of the economy. You have a reversion to the state of many elements of the economy. You have a country that is both more aggressive externally and also more insecure. You have a country that has declared that its interests are very, very different from that of the West, and that indeed it's the West that's declining and the East, meaning China, is rising. So this is a totally different situation than the situation that helped impel the negotiation of the agreement to join the WTO to begin with. So could you do that negotiation now under those circumstances? No. Would it be great if it were different? Yes, there's no question. It would be great if the situation were other than it was. But the situation is as it is. And so the issue becomes not one of negotiation of these large agreements, but you hope much, much smaller, far less ambitious initiatives that speak to issues like cooperation and relationship management. And that's really what's being pursued now.
And that's what I wanted to turn to, was coming to the here and now. I mean, competition obviously is part of every aspect of U.S. China relations today. That's absolutely true, and it will be true for quite a long time. That doesn't mean we won't be able to cooperate on things. That doesn't mean we won't try to make progress taking advantage of circumstances in our countries and on the global stage. But my first question on this is, if you could talk to us a little bit about what the economic policies are. Now, I think most Americans are worried about economic competition with China. I do think most Americans think decoupling from China is not a good idea. It would result in a lot of challenges for the United States, obviously a lot of challenges for China, but effectively to reduce the vulnerabilities of interdependence, as you were suggesting a minute ago. Both of our countries are putting in place some barriers to protect our national security interests, try to enhance, economic prosperity, potentially with other groups, but maintain a robust economic relationship. Could you talk a little bit about how de-risking as a economic strategy can work and how the Biden administration is trying to put that forward?
So China has been decoupling probably for 25 years. Think about the Great Firewall of China. What's that about? It's about greater control of the internet. It's about content control or sharp content moderation. It's become, to some extent, in some parts of the internet, access to control of access. And then when you go to programs like Indigenous Innovation and Made in China 2025 and all that stuff, these are all import substitution programs, explicitly so, explicitly so. You know, 10% of our industry is dependent on foreign companies. We want that number reduced to 4%, and then we want that number to go down to 2%. This is import substitution, classic, invented by a former Brazilian economics professor, a brilliant guy, but who was president of Brazil, big on import substitution. And this is really what China adopted. And that decoupling and the explicit desire to decouple, 14th five-year plan said it best. China wishes to be independent, self-sufficient, but increase third country dependence on China so as to increase China's leverage. That's almost a quote from the 14th five-year plan. It's very explicit. So this is a decoupling scenario, right? Self-sufficiency. The U.S. came to this much later. And but for COVID and PPE, it's not clear to me the U.S. would have adopted some of the policies it has. But that experience during COVID, I think, was seminal for the United States. The idea that here was something so basic, but we were utterly dependent on, and there was no supply, there was no homegrown supply. And the notion, how could we leave ourselves in that vulnerable position? And of course, that realization morphed. The way small yards, high fences, has morphed to some extent to a bigger yard, higher fence, which will morph to a bigger yard, so on and so forth. These things morph. And that's really, I think, what happened starting with PPE. Prior to that, I think the U.S. didn't think all that much about its dependency on China. It sort of reveled in the fact that China was rather more dependent on the U.S., particularly in technology. Can, de-risking work? Well, it certainly doesn't work if you feel your national security is at risk. Not too much works under that scenario. And if targeted de-risking makes the U.S. feel more secure, more in control, safer, protected, that becomes the direction of policy. And that's really what has happened here. The competitiveness angle is slightly different in the sense that I'm very big on competition. I've never seen anything that got much worse because of competition, but we've all seen stuff that got a whole lot better because of competition. I'm thinking Japanese cars in the 70s and 80s, smaller, fuel efficient, and 100% reliable compared to what the US was churning out in the 1980s. It's a very different scenario. But we had to get our game together, and we ultimately did. It's a sort of a classic example of competition really making something better, ultimately for everybody, producers and consumers. What worries me about the competition moniker is this. If you're two companies and you go head to head, I mean aggressively, I mean ferociously, I mean in the most underhanded ways possible, right? You're about to go to war, these two companies. What happens? Some government agency will say, wait a minute, you guys are, you, company A, you're predatory, and you're acting in a predatory manner, cut it out. And company B, by the way, you aren't so pure, cut it out. There's an intervening force that disciplines that competition, disciplines it. Think now about the U.S. and China. Who disciplines the U.S. and China when the competition becomes genuinely ferocious? The answer is no one. No one. The two policemen have to be the U.S. and China. The notion of guardrails around the relationship, I think, is aimed for getting at exactly that fear. That at the end of the day, the only way to temper competition when it becomes really ferocious is for each country to understand that it has to pull back. It has to pull back. It has to manage the situation in a different way. Whether or not we'll come to an understanding with China, how that management structure should work, we've yet to see. I would take it on faith. I can't imagine either country wants an implosion of some sort. On the other hand, it's important to have a mechanism that can tamp down what could become an extremely dangerous situation. It's sad to me that you don't have effective bodies that can intervene the way a regulator can intervene and discipline the parties. But if you think about the world and you think about all of the countries in it and capabilities, I don't think it exists.
That was going to be my next question, actually. We're talking a lot about U.S. China as well, we should, but the way that China and the United States treat other countries in this global competition with one another is quite consequential for the business clients that I serve, the nonprofits, the universities. And so I guess my last question to you, I do want to open it up to others, is how should we try to be promoting in this very competitive environment between the U.S. and China new ways to bring in other voices so that that competition can be more constructive. It's realistic because that is where we are. But what can the National Committee do? Not just talking to U.S. and China, but bringing in other kinds of stakeholders to try to strengthen what you just said is so weak right now, and that is the role of other bodies.
I'd really like to hear what you have to say about this. I really would, because so first of all, the role of other countries and the role of the National Committee. Role of other countries, I think other countries view their role as having been fulfilled if they don't choose between the U.S. and China, but straddle. Straddle strategy makes the most sense. You extract benefits from both the U.S. and China. What's to lose, right? You choose and you lose that optionality and you lose that leverage. So I think for countries, there's a kind of, well, if we don't choose, then we're kind of in the clear, as though what would happen between the US and China wouldn't affect them at the end of the day. So I think there's a bit of a misperception or wishful thinking on the part of countries generally, not trying to step up or step in or really express their views in a more overt and constructive way than they do. You know, countries are shying, pulling back. You see this even in Europe, right? Where there is concern about the US approach in many ways, it's totally understandable, and where Europe feels it has to strike out in a different way. Hard to imagine Europe becoming enmeshed if the US and China were enmeshed in a negative way. Instead, Europe, I think, feels comfortable about its relationship with the US so long as it doesn't treat this issue in some outrageous manner, and wants to ensure that it maintains positive relations with China. And I think for Europe, this is exactly right. So I think countries have to really think about their role as important to maintain stability. Stability just doesn't happen. We're in a world where it has to be maintained. It has to be actively pursued. And I think many countries shy away from that responsibility, and that's unfortunate. I think for the National Committee, I said this to the phenomenal National Committee team that you have, just really astonishing people, that when times are good, what the National Committee does is a really nice to have. When times are the way they are now, what the National Committee does is essential. It's not a nice to have. It's a have to have. Because in a period of instability and volatility and acrimony, creating avenues that provide some relief, some outlet, some series of vectors that didn't exist before, that provide a backdoor for both sides to be able to take a deep breath. This is absolutely vital, completely vital. And the National Committee, I think, is so successful in both countries at helping to provide those avenues and those outlets and those vectors on which sort of pieces of stability can be knit together. You need every possible route to ensuring the US and China understand their broader responsibilities to the rest of the world, as well as ultimately, frankly, their responsibilities to each other. And every route that you can create that reinforces that need is critical. The thing about the National Committee is that it has such high credibility with the US government and the Chinese government that the two governments understand the committee isn't hosting tea parties, that its work is really vital. And I think both governments believe that very sincerely. So I think if some countries were a little more like the National Committee, I would be more comfortable than I am right now.
I'm going to open it up to questions, but before I do, I'll just say one thing about that that last question. I do think that circumstances and stakeholders matter so much right now and give the National Committee opportunities to chip away in a very concrete way on different elements of the relationship
I agree
that
with
require more stabilization. China's, difficulty with its economic recovery, the United States being in a political season right now, both mean that the business community, that academics, that civil society has a role to play, maybe taking advantage of these things to find a way forward on very, very specific issues. And I think the National Committee is that platform to do that kind of work. And let me open it up to all of the members. Yes. Could you identify yourself, please?
Frank Kale. I have a, I guess you could call it a case study question, and it involves TikTok. My economic education doesn't have a place for what is the policy regarding TikTok, which then raises the question, is it all a security issue? And if it is a security issue, is there a basis for it? Because it seems to be anti-competitive. It seems to deny free trade. And it doesn't make sense. So could you justify it?
I've never used TikTok, but I know whatever you do on it is like 15 seconds. So in 15 seconds, can I justify it? You know what? From what I can glean, because I'm definitely not a TikTok expert, the issue with TikTok is the algorithm that's used. And the question arises either the power of that algorithm is something that's bothering people in the security community, or perhaps what's hidden in the algorithm is bothering people in the security community. I have absolutely no idea. I generally don't favor bans. Bans are extremely harsh. They're too final, they're too inflexible. And once you ban, it's very hard to unban, right? Circumstances have to be so radically different that what you find instead is whatever you banned back then continues on long after any rationale has passed, if there was ever a rationale. So why the administration feels as it does with TikTok, this is not clear to me. From the outside, as a layperson when it comes to TikTok, it looks like fun. And if I did social media, I'd probably be on TikTok.
Next question. Third row.
Hi, my name is Valentina. I'm an incoming Schwarzman scholar, so this topic is very near and dear to my heart, and thank you for being here. My question is around the last question Amy asked about other countries' role in this competition, and specifically I want to ask about Mexico and the nearshoring that's happening, specifically around the manufacturing and Northern Shore in Monterrey. Last year, Mexico became basically the top exporter to the US, and that increase is matched by Mexico's import from China. So it seems like a lot of Chinese companies are just moving to Mexico and then exporting to the US. And the Biden administration, of course, they're not stupid, so they've already started talking to the Mexico government. I was curious about what do you see happen next? And I'm curious about this because I think a lot of business communities are thinking about investments in Mexico for all these manufacturing facilities.
Yeah. It's a great question. Look, supply chains are beginning to shift slowly, not so slow in the case of Mexico, but slowly, generally speaking. Those shifts create some dislocations. Some countries will be disadvantaged. Some, like Mexico, are advantaged because of it. But whether actually you've gained security or efficiency is an open question. So let's assume we nearshore from Mexico, but every factory we nearshore from is a Chinese factory. So is our security enhanced if the reason the administration wanted to reroute supply chains was to avoid Chinese companies? No, the rationale doesn't hold at all. There are these unintended kind of spillover consequences that happen when governments tend to intervene in the way that we're intervening. I understand the motivation, I understand the intentionality behind it, but you have to think about what else changes, what else you're spawning when you take these kinds of measures. I think in the case of Mexico, the situation is very delicate because of NAFTA and what that implies. And so there's no doubt the administration is looking at this, talking to the Mexican government, as you said. There's no doubt if there were another administration, they would also be talking to Mexico and try and do what they could to avoid a situation that they were trying to avoid when they shifted supply chains. Do you invest or not in Mexico? There are a trillion considerations on investment by companies, one of which is obviously certainty of access to the U.S. That wouldn't be the only consideration, not at all, but certainty of access. And in the case of Mexico and NAFTA, I would think certainty of access is a questionable proposition. Keith?
Thank you. Take your point about the benefits of competition and also the benefits of a level playing field. But in a world of predatory competitors and industrial policy unevenly applied and state capitalism, what's your thoughts about reciprocity?
You know, the reciprocity debate's an old debate. I mean, this goes back now to the 1960s, 1970s. And early on, I don't remember if it was the 60s or 70s, you have the Reciprocal Trade Act, which was a famous piece of legislation. If you think about issues of fairness, level playing field, yeah, you'd probably think in terms of reciprocity, right? It's a little sort of an eye for an eye kind of deal. The problem with it is that when you think about issues of fairness, you think about obviously the sector you're in, but you also have to think about all of the surrounding ecosystem for that sector. And does pure reciprocity help or actually hurt all of that surrounding ecosystem? It isn't just a company. It's the company, it's the suppliers, it's the attendant communities. And if you had a strict reciprocity rule, a widget for a widget, regardless, and then you decide you're not giving me the widget and you yank it out of your, you yank it out in trade terms, what happens to all that surrounding business? What happens to those communities? There's a harshness about it, an inflexibility, which I don't particularly care for. It sounds good. It sounds great politically. But in practice, it leads to results that are too inflexible and that don't allow for the kind of trading you need to allow for when you're talking about economic exchange. I'll give you this bundle, you give me that different bundle, because I know you need this and you know I need that. It's not reciprocity, but it's fair. So I would look to fairness first. Reciprocity may be a tool of fairness if it's applied appropriately, but otherwise you need much greater flexibility and an appreciation of your comparative advantages, their comparative advantages, to actually come up with an arrangement that's genuinely fair.
I think you answered that actually in response to the TikTok question. You didn't say, well, Google's not allowed in China, you know, so why not? I mean, it is apples and
Yeah,
oranges.
no,
right?
yeah. I mean, look, it's easy to say, you don't let our social media in, we won't let your social media in. What bothers me about that, apart from what I just said, it's a very inflexible proposition, is that every time we cut off something else, every time China cuts off something else, you make conflict more likely, not less likely. I honestly believe that. Because you cut off everything, you got nothing to lose. You have no countervailing interest. I don't think that's a comfortable situation among great powers. Maybe it's okay if the balance of power were radically different, but among great powers, I think that that's a dangerous proposition. To put it another way, the fact that economic exchange may not lead to democracy doesn't mean economic exchange is somehow antithetical to your interests or can't enhance other interests you might have. There's no one explanation for economic exchange. If I don't have that, then I have nothing. That's not the way business thinks. It's not actually the way people think. And it's not that situation here either. So I think we just have to be a little smarter and a little less focused on the rhetoric.
Sounds like a real trade negotiator to me talking. We have time for one last question, if anybody has one. About straight in the middle, in the back. Sorry, Steve. You get the last question, Steve, but we have one more behind you.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Wei Shun. I'm currently
Wonderful.
affiliated with United Nations. I have a particular question on the current tariff on EV. I'm personally a little bit confused by the fact that most Chinese EVs are now selling as double their original price in US and Europe. For instance, Polestar, the price is almost double compared to the price in China. In the US market, and BYD is also, the price has been doubled. I'm curious, how can you be dumping in these markets while you double your price over there? And what has been observed recently in China is that they have welcomed Tesla to sell as half of its price in US for their cars in China. They welcomed the Gigafactory. They removed the last bit of restriction on Tesla recently. They also removed the subsidies for most Chinese EVs. So you can see a huge wave of bankruptcy by Chinese EV manufacturers. In my case, it seems like the US is pursuing a trade policy with Chinese characteristics. And it is not, in this particular field, it is not China who is creating an uneven level playing field. So I appreciate your insights on this issue. Thank you.
Look, whether or not China is dumping, that's an arithmetic issue, right? And there are these calculations you make, and it's pretty well standard stuff. The subsidies are a more serious concern because they're enormous. I mean, genuinely enormous. Maybe not as big as in semiconductors, which are super enormous, but they're enormous nonetheless. And that gives Chinese producers certain advantages that producers in market economies don't get, certainly not to that extent. On the other hand, China is a manufacturing powerhouse, not just of EVs, but I mean, you know, generally speaking, it's a manufacturing center. It's the manufacturer for Asia initially, but then of course beyond. And that has to be recognized as something that may be the product of subsidies, but is also the product of continual innovation and expertise. So it's, look, it's conceivable that the EV situation wouldn't be as bad, but for rampant overcapacity in so many sectors in China, right? Producing 30% more steel than every consumer could consume in China. That's not rational. None of that's rational. And so EVs are of concern. It's the auto sector, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the concern is also hyped because you do have substantial overcapacity. And so when you think overcapacity, the first trade remedy you think of is dumping, right? You just have to get rid of the stuff. And so that's the first remedy people think about on EVs, dumping, because of overcapacity, in large part magnified by the general trend in China, perhaps mandate in China, toward overcapacity in a variety of sectors.
Steve, last question, please.
Should we, as we put these tariffs in place, should we be encouraging Chinese companies to invest in the United States and create the jobs in the United States, whether it's EV batteries, EVs, batteries for grids, all these things where we're putting these high tariffs on, but we don't seem to be following a policy that encourages the Chinese to invest and create these jobs at home?
Well, you saw that with the battery factory spat. So yeah, there's a bit of a disjunction that is high tariffs. So don't send your stuff here. And by the way, don't make it here, which if you're concerned about jobs, you might take a different view of how rational that is. You know, years ago, there was a really wonderful debate between Laura Tyson and Bob Reich. And it had to do with the question whether ownership mattered. And this was in the context of Japan. Did it matter that the company was owned by the Japanese, if the company would invest in the US and create jobs in the US? Why does the origin of the headquarters of the company or nationality of the company matter so why does ownership matter if the jobs are here? And they took opposite sides. And it's a debate that was never resolved because there are pros and cons to both sides of the argument. And what's winning on this side is, yes, ownership matters. So you don't want, even if it would create jobs here, you actually don't want the investment here. And that's sort of the battery example.
For national security reasons.
For national security reasons. You know, so same with investing in land, right? Right, it's in situ, you can't take it out. But it's the same issue. It is, look, it speaks to what you started this whole thing with. And that is complete distrust. No trust, zero. Interestingly, the US and China have this entirely in common. No, think about all that we, I think about this all the time, all that we have in common. We dislike each other. All right, we both dislike each other. We distrust each other. Okay, that's two things we have in common now. There's a whole list of these I go through in my mind when I can't sleep. Some people count sheep. I do this. Because I keep thinking there's something there to work with to come to an agreement on something. So I'll leave you with the hope that we'll find some new agreement.
Maybe unfortunately, maybe we're undermining some of our own interests. And that is something that we have in common with some of these policies. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Barshefsky for being with us.